Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making it here at 8 o'clock. We are going to start with this panel entitled the Global, sorry, what is it? It's here for the Global Tax Reform. We have an excellent panel here with speakers coming from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and from Europe. And we heard in Paris the UN Secretary General speaking about the need for a transformation for the global financial architecture. We have heard that although we are halfway through the SDG agenda, we are nowhere near. And the underlying reason, one of them, is lack of financing. In this panel, we are going to be talking about why we need a bold and transformative agenda, a proper reform of the tax system to make this happen. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Dereje Alemayehu, who is the Executive Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Dereje, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have a sore throat on my way to lose my voice, but I hope to be able to speak the next 10 minutes. The topic is, I don't know, it's a large topic. We have been discussing this in this compound also several times, but I want to highlight two things really. What is the problem, which solutions are being offered, and why we prefer a UN-based solution. Why we need a global tax reform will be clear from the very fact that the current laws and practices are from 100 years ago, established by the League of Nations before many countries today, independent countries today were not existent, where colonial powers just agreed amongst themselves how to divide the tax pie among themselves. Secondly, since that time, also the global economy has changed, globalization has reached another level, digitalization of the economy, all these problems. So yet, the laws are established 100 years ago, they need a reform. The second one, this was from the outset clear. And now, in whose favor or how should that be done? Because when the taxing rights were divided, many countries were not independent. So how to ensure their taxing rights in the changed situation? That was the major issue. So normally the successor of the League of Nations is the United Nations, so it is logical that the UN should have taken up this role. But this was prevented. The rich countries wanted it to happen in the OECD because they are the ones who are making the rules there. So this debate between UN as a universal body and OECD as the club of the rich, who makes it the global tax rules, that has been a debate for a long time. The OECD rich countries, they have up to now, up to recently, been able to block this process at the United Nations. If some of you were following it, in 2015, there was the UN Financing for Development Conference in Addis. During the negotiations here in New York, normally the outcome document will be agreed before the conference takes place, but they were not able to agree on the outcome document. So they went to Addis for the final conference with a paragraph in it, G77 countries demanding a UN tax body, and OECD countries saying no to that. When they reached in Addis, they did not even negotiate. The powerful OECD countries said, we will not negotiate until this paragraph is taken out of the outcome document. So they were able to block the conference. Then the G77 countries considered saying, we will take it out of the paragraph, but only because also Ethiopia as a host country put pressure on them. And they said, but we are not giving it up. We are taking the paragraph out of this current outcome document, but not from our struggle. So they continued for a UN tax body, for a UN-based tax intergovernmental tax negotiations. So things were at this, in this context that last October, when the Africa Group submitted its resolution to bring an intergovernmental tax negotiation process into the UN, it was agreed unanimously. There were complaints, there were attempts to water it down through amendments, but it didn't happen. So the UN passed a resolution stating that an intergovernmental inclusive process for effective tax cooperation has to start at the United Nations. So this is another problem. Now, the process has started in the UN literally, but what is happening now is what is not being able to be fought out in this house is being carried out elsewhere. The OECD is still insisting on claiming to be tax rule maker and standard setter. And they have created, so in the first place, the OECD process, just to say briefly, if you look at it, it is not addressing the major challenge of the international tax rules. What does it consist of? It consists of profit shifting through the organization of multinationals in such a manner that they trade with one another, and then the OECD recognizes that they are trading with one another as independent entities, which is a fiction. If this were the case, just tell me why there are 36 companies registered in the British Virgin Islands per inhabitant. 36 companies per inhabitant. Why is it that an island in the island of Jersey is a major banana exporter to the rest of Europe? Why is Panama the country with #1 commercial fleet in the world? So the way companies are organized is all for profit shifting purposes. The OECD leaves them out, recognizes this fiction that they are trading with each other as foreign entities with one another. The second one is the whole OECD reform called Pillar 1 looks at 86 companies, 86 multinational companies, and the amount, the percentage of general global profit to be apportioned to source countries. Source countries is 10% of the global profit of 86 companies. Can you take this to be a fundamental reform of international tax rules? Most of the companies are out of scope. And in fact, it's not an NGO publication. The revenue authorities head of Nigeria was saying, if we were to accept Pillar 1 solution of the OECD, we will not only not tax new companies, we will be forced not to tax the companies we are taxing today. So it is a very nice, you cannot call it fixing a broken system if it applies only to 10% of global profit and only to 86 multinational companies. The second one is the Pillar 2 thing. They have, at the origin of the discussion, civil society were asking 25% global minimum tax, but this was the average, which is now in many nominal tax rates around the world. Even the US was asking 21% minimum corporate tax. Notorious tax haven secrecy jurisdictions were asking for 12.5. So what is 15% closer to? It is closer to 12.5 than 21. So now that is now the minimum standard, the minimum agreed standard the OECD is pushing for. It will lead to a race to the minimum. Countries will be under pressure to lower their tax rates to this level. And then the second one is the allocation it brings to developing countries. So the EU Tax Observatory did a research and found out that this measure will at best give 2% revenue rise in developing countries, but 16% in rich countries. So the reform the OECD is doing is not only biased against developing countries, it clearly favors rich countries. The other one is this. They want to prevent developing countries from introducing unilateral measures to enhance their tax revenue. The major thing they are trying to achieve is to prevent countries. Let me give an example. Kenya was one of the countries which refused to agree to the OECD two-pillar solution. On another topic, they were negotiating a trade agreement with the US. The US insisted they are not going to sign a trade agreement with them until Kenya withdraws its digital service tax. A condition. And the funny thing is, of all countries in the world, it is the US which is not going to sign this agreement. They want to hand-tie countries for laws which is not going to apply to themselves. This is the OECD process. And recently, you might have seen it in the Financial Times of 3 days ago, the IMF, Sri Lanka is one of the countries which has said no to the OECD tax two-pillar solutions. They are negotiating fresh loan with the IMF. The IMF asked them, we will not give you this unless you accept the OECD rules, unless you withdraw your digital service tax. So all the powers of which are lobbied by the multinational companies are putting countries under pressure to to accept UN tax rules. So what I'm trying to show with these examples is the moment the fight in the UN was lost by rich OECD countries, they increased their pressure on developing countries to cede their taxing rights. What is happening now is there is a pressure, a struggle on outside this institution, the United Nations, to force countries under duress to concede their taxing rights because they are defending their rights here. So why did we try to organize this thing? It is to say the fight has to come back to the UN, because the UN is the only country, the only institution with universal membership. Unless unless we go back to a feudal structure where the oligarchy determines the fate of everything, and you cannot democratize oligarchy. OECD is an oligarchy club of the rich. It is working in the interest of its members. It is created for that. But the UN is the only institution which can serve the interests of developing countries, which can enable them to defend their taxing rights. It's not about any donation or grant. It is about taxing rights as sovereign nations. It's about taxing profits generated in your economy. It's about illegalizing profit shifting, which is making... I'll finish it. When we started the tax campaign in Africa, there was a belief that Africa lives on the life support it gets from the North. We tried proving that resources flow out of Africa more than they come in. Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. For every $1 coming in the form of ODA to Africa, $3 leave the continent. What is the sum of +1 minus 3? So you cannot finance development with -2. So that is why the fight has to come to the UN, and the solution has to be sought here, where countries can negotiate as equals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dereje. That's great. And I hope that everyone is just taking note about why we all need to be pushing for a UN tax convention and to further this UN tax solution, and the pressure that is really coming from the OECD, from hidden channels, from sometimes even very open channels. So it is great that Dereje was pointing all this out, and also for countries to understand that when they are signing to this inclusive framework, they will be losing money. So these unilateral tax measures is definitely a possibility still. So next we are going to be hearing from Jason Braganza, who is the Executive Director from AFRODADD. Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So I want to pick up from where Dereje has left off on, he's given us a very good context of why, or the historical context of why we've reached the point where we are on calling for this UN tax convention and civil society groups, but also, being championed very strongly here in New York by the Africa Group. And in building on that, let me start with the conversation around illicit financial flows and how that conversation is very pivotal to not only the halftime summary that we received on Monday about the SDG agenda, but also how that was the stimulus in getting us to where we are today. For a very long time, the issue of illicit financial flows was considered in very narrow terms on the illegality of financial resources that were generated and moved across different jurisdictions and borders into safe havens. But when it was realized through very hard work on research and advocacy by civil society organizations that there was also a legal way to actually move money, an illegal way to move money that was generated in a legal way in undermining tax systems, it was very important that these resources were being captured as part of the illicit financial flows that were moving from developing countries into tax havens. And this was how, in terms of how companies and multinational corporations were actually establishing themselves, and also how jurisdictions were using weaknesses in the global economic governance setup to facilitate and attract and making their jurisdictions domiciles for the movement of these resources. So the aggressive and very harmful tax practices that were being implemented by multinational corporations in developing countries, and I think many of you in the room will have heard of instances where big multinational corporations were paying much, much less tax in developing countries than the citizens of those developing countries in itself. And just to give you a bit of, that sort of idea of how the illicit financial flows conversation was being developed and being articulated in a system where billions of dollars were being generated in revenue, but very little was actually being allowed to be taxed because of this economic system that promoted and allowed multinational corporations to structure themselves in a way to move money out of developing countries into these tax havens and these low tax jurisdictions. The second point around the illicit financial flows and why it is important in terms of the conversation we're having here today is because when you look at the volumes of the numbers, particularly just from Africa, they've increased. In 2015, when the very important report that was published under the auspices of His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, the high-level panel on illicit financial flows, the estimated amount of illicit financial flows from Africa was around 50 billion. And this was using also a very specific, very specific type of definition. Today, that figure has close to doubled. It's nearly $100 billion leaving Africa in the form of illicit financial flows. To put that into a bigger context, the additional money that's being asked by the SDG, by the SG to finance the SDG agenda is $500 billion annually. So a fifth of that money essentially is being lost in illicit financial flows from one part of the world, right? 1/5 of what the SG is asking for in his additional SDG financing is being lost from one part of the developing world, or the global south, and this is the continent of Africa. So this is very important. Why then addressing the issue of illicit financial flows through the way companies are being organized, in the way companies are conducting their business in developing countries is extremely important, because in the current setup, the illicit financial flows that are being generated through a very aggressive and abusive and harmful tax practices are actually being legitimized. And this is what Dereje, in part of what Dereje's submission is trying to illustrate, and why then it was important for us to challenge as civil society and as member states from the global south to challenge this architecture and this system that was legitimizing the generation and movement of illicit financial flows from the global south to the global north, and thus making developing countries and citizens from the developing regions subsidizing multinational corporations in that sense. The second point I wanted to make on this conversation is why it is important to understand the intersection of illicit financial flows, tax, and other forms of development finance. The cycle or the logical flow of how this all works is very simple. You have illicit financial flows that are being generated. You've got, and being moved out of developing regions, which then automatically leaves a revenue deficit in the developing regions. Developing regions then try to use taxation to plug that revenue gap, but they cannot do certain taxes because, as Dereje said, certain trade deals or certain IMF agreements cannot be signed because there's a certain type of taxes that you cannot impose. So what do? You transfer the tax burden that should be on multinational corporations, you transfer that tax burden onto citizens. So you have very regressive tax systems and tax policies that are being given as advice from the international institutions to our countries. You see the tax burden moving increasingly to those of vulnerable groups, particularly women and young people, and thus having this situation where the inability of governments to then transform or even move up in terms of generating revenues, but instead what is happening is that they're using regressive tax policies to raise finance. But in addition to that, you've got a situation then where the tax revenue, no matter how punitive the tax policy is, it's not enough. And so you then end up not only with a revenue deficit, you end up with an entire fiscal deficit or a budget deficit. And then that forces countries to then say, well, we don't have money, we need to borrow. And then when you end up borrowing, you need to go to different parts of creditors to get money. And so you can see the logical flow or the vicious cycle that then global south countries and developing country governments are being put in, the corner that they're being put in. And all of this stemming from a system that perpetuates and encourages and promotes the idea of generation of illicit financial flows through very aggressive, harmful tax practices, very punitive and regressive ability to tax multinational corporations, and instead transferring the burden of taxation to its citizens. And so with these two dimensions, it's very easy to hopefully understand then why it's important for there to be a complete overhaul of how the global tax system works, but also more importantly, an overhaul in a way that allows member states of countries in the global south to have a better and stronger voice in a system where they can articulate the challenges at the policy level in raising, dealing with illicit financial flows, but then also using tax policy to raise and generate tax revenues without transferring that tax burden onto citizens. And my final point really is about how the connection between the system that Dereje has talked about and this propagation of a liberalization type approach, a political economy that is hell-bent on market-based solutions, and this idea that you can only achieve the SDGs, you can only achieve economic development, growth, and transformation through a market-based approach. This is not true. It's a fallacy. Yeah? African governments, for example, in particular, are subsidizing their future growth to accommodate creditors right now. Yeah? The debt crisis they are facing, as a result of these fiscal deficits resulting from illicit financial flows, resulting from inability to generate tax revenues, is forcing them to actually trade off their future transformation, to appease their creditors. And the reason for this is because all they're being told is the only way to come out of the crisis is to borrow some more, give the market and financial markets confidence that you are a good debtor or a good borrower, and then they will release more money. But there is no transformative agenda in this finance. Instead, what it's doing, it's suppressing any potential transformative ability of developing countries on the continent. So I think it's very important for us to look at then how the global economic governance of the financial architecture is then set up, and why it makes a very compelling case why countries like Zambia, countries like Barbados, South Africa, Kenya, have dismissed this idea that things can actually happen in Europe, in OECD, and why they are actually pushing through the Africa Group very strongly for a reformed global financial architecture. And we must also not be caught up when friends and foes in the global north are adopting this kind of narrative, because what they're doing is they're capturing the narrative by saying they need a reformed global financial architecture, but introducing or maintaining the same processes, maintaining the same policy prescriptions that maintain the status quo. So we must be also very careful that when our Africa group, when our developing country groups are talking about architecture reform, we support that view and not a view of architecture reform according to the G7 and according to countries in the global north, because that capturing of the narrative is also a very important way of undermining the calls that we are making as civil society groups to actually advance this global tax convention to sit within the United Nations. And I think with that, I'll pause there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. Really, and we are doing actually really good on time. So in terms of like how this tax system really legitimizes this subsidizing from the part of the low and middle income countries to rich countries, how all this burden, the tax burden, is actually being passed to citizens and to vulnerable groups, and they are paying more than corporations, and this again keeps being legitimized. And I really take this like capturing of the narrative of the global, of the economic architecture and being transformed, and how now it's being co-opted by the G7 and the OECD, and they're actually using it to again legitimize this oligarchy, as Dereje was pointing out, and how it's really undermining not only the economy in these countries, but also the SDGs, also human rights, because without revenue, human rights cannot actually be delivered, right? So this is something that we all need to be caring about, even if we are coming from different constituencies. So now, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our third speaker, who is Tony Salvador. If you do that, I think that, oh yeah, I can still tell, no, that's fine. Tony Salvador, who represents TAFJA as well as the Third World Network. Tony, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Tony Salvador from Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, and also from Third World Network. So basically, we're extremely happy about the UN resolution 244-77 on the promotion of international cooperation, an effective promotion of international cooperation at the UN. And we want the negotiations basically to begin. Unfortunately, even before the negotiations have begun, there are already serious attempts to undermine the negotiations in terms of having a carve-out for electronic commerce. As Dereje pointed out earlier on, there's this process with regard to the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting, basically to address the issue of non-taxation of e-commerce, especially for non-resident foreign corporations doing business in developing countries in so-called market jurisdictions. We want a system which is very comprehensive and no carve-outs for any of the for any sector whatsoever. This is important for us because we belong to developing countries. TAFJA, basically the more active people or groups in TAFJA belong to India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Indonesia. And in all of these countries, we, unfortunately, our governments saw it fit to give fiscal incentives through the decades. Despite the fact there are studies after studies which say that fiscal incentives are not really that important when investors try to decide when they go to whether or not they want to invest in a certain country. And it becomes even more ridiculous with respect to mining, the extractive sectors, because obviously mining will not follow the tax incentives. The mines are there for them to be used. No? Aside from the fiscal incentives, there's a race to the bottom in terms of lowering the corporate income taxes. So in the Philippines, 4 or 5 years ago, we lowered the income tax from 35% to only 25% and even 20% for some types of company. And as Dereje earlier on alluded to, there's a problem with respect to taxing the digital platforms because of the nature of their business. Obviously, the digital platforms do not have to have physical presence or what's called permanent establishment to make tons and tons of money. So in this way, when they make tons and tons of money in developing countries, and sometimes even in developed countries, since they don't have PE or physical presence, they're not subjected to corporate income tax. They're not subjected to value-added tax. And at the same time, obviously, this is also a competition policy issue because they will have to compete with domestic corporations who are paying all of these kinds of taxes. As Dereje also mentioned earlier on, there's a need to reform the 104-year-old international tax architecture because the economy, the nature of the global economy has changed since the advent of the League of Nations. No? So now we have very sophisticated global value chains. E-commerce has been increasing through the years and obviously will increase through the years. And it's become more important. Services has become more important through the years. And all of this phenomena allows multinational corporations especially, and even rich individuals, to do what's called tax planning. Because of the importance of intangible properties, they are able to move the intangible properties to low tax jurisdictions or to zero tax jurisdictions, and like basically park all of the profits there through royalties and other forms. I mean, there are countless forms of tax planning that are being used by multinational companies, and these have to be addressed. Dereje and Jason, I think, also alluded to transfer pricing. The transfer pricing rules were instituted around 1960. And of course, each of our countries are probably trying to address these issues by legislating controlled foreign corporation laws. For example, in the US, which began in 1962. But still, the tax planners and the multinational corporations have been so sophisticated and have been on their toes that they're able to game the system through the decades. So there's really need for a very comprehensive reform of the international tax system, and that can only happen through the United Nations. The OECD, as I mentioned earlier on, is trying to say, well, the United Nations is not fit. The developing countries, in a condescending way, obviously, do not have the technical capacity to understand these things, to institute reforms on the domestic front and also at the international front. So instead of the United Nations tackling this issue, very complicated issue of e-commerce, why don't we just forget about e-commerce at the UN and allow the OECD to do its work? But as Dereje mentioned earlier on, they have Pillars 1 and Pillar 2. None of them, well, we're very much opposed to the both of them. In terms of Pillar 1, the in-scope companies are only those who are earning more than 20 billion euros per year. If you fall short by 1 penny of 20 billion euros, then you're out of scope. Then you're not covered by Pillar 1. And even if you're covered by Pillar 1, the only thing that will be taxed is anything more than 10% of your margins. And that anything could be zero, obviously. That anything also can be $20 that will be divided among 30 market jurisdictions. So I guess it's easy to understand how little that is. In the meantime, while we are trying to reform the tax system, obviously each country should be allowed to basically pass tax laws to tax multinational corporations, to tax non-resident foreign platforms. And that's being done right now through digital services tax. India, I think, call it equitable levy, no? Correctly calls it equitable levy. But certain rich countries find that not to their interest. And actually, there is this discourse which actually demonize digital services tax by calling them unilateral impositions. But obviously, as we all know, almost all taxes are unilaterally imposed by our respective parliaments and our respective congresses. Maybe there's international tax agreements in terms of tax treaties and what have you, in terms of trade agreements, etc., but they constitute only a very small part of the total international tax laws. I don't know if you can recall that a couple of years ago, France was threatened with trade sanctions for imposing digital services tax. A few years ago, there's this agreement between, on the one hand, the US, France, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, and Austria, saying that, okay, the US will not impose trade sanctions on you. You can continue imposing digital services tax, but once there's a Pillar 1 solution, then you will have to stop all of your digital services tax, and whatever you have collected should be credited towards the Pillar 1 liability. The Pillar 2 speaks of 15% minimum corporate income tax, but that only works for corporations in their head offices and for corporations where they have branches. That only works for jurisdictions with branches, with physical establishments, with permanent establishment, etc., etc. And they do not work for market jurisdictions, well, because there's no physical presence. So, meantime, while we are trying to have this international cooperation and negotiations, I think it's extremely important to defend the ability of countries to impose digital services tax or equalization levy. We at GATJ are very much in favor of continuing on with starting and continuing on with the negotiations, and eventually having a UN tax convention and a UN tax body. Of course, you all know that there's a UN tax committee right now, or a committee of experts. But these experts and individuals actually represent themselves and not their respective countries. So we want a situation where each country will be represented at the table on an equal basis. And finally, we want to have a UN tax convention that will cover everything, because we cannot see a situation where e-commerce is carved out, because e-commerce is related to so many aspects of the economy, be it bricks and mortars, be it mining. In fact, we were surprised when we had this meeting in Manila at TAFJA last week to find out that even in mining, e-commerce extremely important. So obviously, e-commerce is also important in the global value chains, etc., etc. So we cannot see a situation where e-commerce is carved out. You have separate rules for e-commerce and separate rules for everything else, because these are actually very much interlinked, and it's impossible to I mean, complicated as they are already, it's impossible to make parallel rules for digital and non-digital. And hopefully, with this UN tax convention and UN tax body, we can address the issues of like illicit financial flows, the gaming of rules in terms of thin capitalization. You know, they're trying to play around with games with debt and equity, because the interest in debt is deductible while dividends are not deductible. So, of course, each of our countries have rules on thin capitalization, but you know, they are still being violated left and right. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize that each country has the ability to actually address these tax issues. We hate the notion of rich countries and experts, etc., etc. The developing countries are ill-equipped to address these issues. At the end of the day, these are parliamentary issues, because at the end of the day, taxation is a congressional power, it's a parliamentary power. In fact, you can even go further. It's power that comes from the people. So to the extent that you say, you know, you developing countries should not talk about that, then in effect, we are being marginalized. We are being taken out of the picture, when in fact, in the very first place, the power actually comes from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tori. Really, really good remarks particularly, I really like that, about that the tax lies on the people. It should be parliamentary, it should be in the Congress, and ultimately, that's what the UN would offer at global level, not the OECD, right? Because that's the group of rich countries, and as we have been saying, that's only representing their own interests. And really good also that you brought the tax havens. And just like to demystify, these are not only the Caribbean countries, right? We see that the biggest tax havens are the US, are the British crown dependencies, as Dereje was mentioning before, are, for instance, also Switzerland with all the secrecy laws. So these are the countries that we don't normally have in mind when we are talking about tax havens. Again, of course, we need a reform, particularly to tax the digital economy, but this is not what they are offering. What they are offering, again, is just to try to pocket all of those profits because of where these companies are headquarters. And what they are asking, particularly low and middle income countries, is to give away their taxing rights. And this is what really we need to be fighting. And that's why the UN tax convention, which would be more democratic and more representative, would really bring, right, rather than the OECD. I always think that if you call something inclusive framework, it's just like saying the honest car dealer, right? We know that this inclusive, they're just like putting it there, but has been anything but inclusive in terms of the negotiations. Now, I'm going to introduce our fourth speaker, Emilia Reyes, who is the program director at Equidad, and she also is the co-convener for the Women Working Group for the Financing for Development. So, Emilia, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for my fellow panelists. This has been very enlightening. And I just want to go back a bit in time to remind us all that when the major powers started their colonial endeavors, they used tax as a way to subjugate new territories. And it seems like they have just changed the way in which they are doing it, but the use of taxation as a tool of the master to undermine the capacity of territories to have a sovereign decision about how to spend their resources, how to ensure the well-being of their population, it has continued to be weaponized all over. And it's happening in front of our eyes. So I found it appalling that we're not really giving it the proper political weight that it should. And also because I think here in the UN, we're not used to talk about coloniality, imperialism, etc. We are expected to talk about Pillar 1, Pillar 2, etc. We are expected to talk in technical terms, but the underlying situation is that powerful countries are depleting resources from the poorest one, from developing countries, to their benefit, in a context of environmental destruction and possibly a threat to life on the planet. So this obsession with wealth accumulation just to have more power, more wealth, and the obsession with exponential growth can only come at the expense of exponential oppression, exponential inequality, exponential devastation for the rest of the planet. So even ethically, from all of the points of entry that we can analyze it, this is just obscene. And it should push us to ensure that developing countries, the African group, had all of the support possible from our end as well, in the upcoming fight that is going to happen in these hallways. And we're also talking in a bigger context here because the international financial architecture is at stake globally. There are many debates about how are we going to reshape it, if any. And but then those debates are also happening again in an illegitimate manner by these same actors that are trying to undermine rule of law and are trying to undermine the possibility of sovereign countries to decide on their own resources. So we've seen just very recently the Paris Summit, in which they claimed to come up with solutions for the global financial architecture and proposing reforms, but they were nothing but a ratification of the existing tools, and furthermore, of the same measures that have led to this financial gap that we see as of today. So whenever they say there is a financial gap, we know who created that financial gap, and they cannot hold the solutions because they are actually giving us the list of what are the solutions and are exactly the same that caused the problem in the first place. So just wanted to be very clear and very blunt about what we're talking about here, and I want to call it a colonial setting and an imperial strategy that is unfolding in front of our eyes, but covered in this technical jargon so that all of us get lost in the technicalities about double shifting, about invoice billing, etc., which is so complex. But what is happening underneath is that there's this very blunt and actually very brutal extraction from the global south to the global north in a moment in which we know that every second count, and with more extraction, we are finding our way towards the destruction of the planet with no possibility to go back. So I don't know in which term we can keep on emphasizing this. So what we're fighting here about the reform of the global financial architecture is not an abstraction that is happening elsewhere where the real economies are moving in our daily lives. It's actually the opposite. There is a battle for what is going to be the solution for humanity and the planet, and it is unfolding right in front of our eyes. So what are we going to do about it? So to me, this is something very meaningful, not only because the Paris Summit, even the Bridgetown Initiative that started as a developing countries initiative and very soon started to be more and more co-opted, and we are seeing it closer again to this technical list of very small demands, right, that are not really transforming anything. And we're seeing in the United Nations, my fellow panelists have insisted that the solution needs to happen in the UN. But what are we seeing in the UN? We're seeing an assault by the Secretary General in proposing our common agenda and a summit of the future with a package of issues that are in and of themselves, each of them undermining the integrity of the United Nations, such as the Digital Compact, in which they're granting again a seat at the table of all of these digital corporations that in the first place undermine the sovereign rights of countries. And now we're seeing as well, for instance, this proposal of biennial summit in the United Nations between the G20, the ECOSOC, the SG, and the IFIs, and also to create a coordination body of this biennial summit to go above overseeing ECOSOC and UN tasks. So how insane is that? To give again a group of countries, the G20 countries, an overview of the work that the United Nations is doing. The G20 countries are already UN members. Why do they need to have an extra saying in a political manner just because they're wealthier? So this is the type of criteria that the Secretary General is using to make decisions about the future of the UN. And we're letting it unfold in front of our eyes, and member states are joining all of these sessions on the Summit of the Future, which is irrational because we are contributing to the dismantling of the United Nations in front of our eyes. So we need to go back. When my fellow panelists say we need solutions that are happening in the United Nations with the principle of universality, when one country, one voice, we're talking about a United Nations that has its integrity savaged and at the moment. So what are we going to do again? So this is a debate. My fellow panelists are talking about a UN tax convention that is so needed in the face of so many other crises that we know about. In parallel, we also want to have a debt workout mechanism, which would be the counterpoint as well on the debt versus tax crisis. But much more, what we're talking about is a comprehensive reform of the system that will allow us to deliver well-being for the people and the planet, and not to keep on ensuring that those who want to profit, even in the face of disaster, the disaster profiteering, that they don't get away with it. And sadly, we have seen developed countries, those who claim to be the defenders of human rights and the rule of law, we are seeing them cynically use this space to dismantle it. So just wanted to emphasize very strongly in the clearest term that this is a takeover on the survival of humanity. When we're talking about the international financial institution, this is what we're talking about, and this is why it's so key not to think that this is a technical conversation, but to understand also where is this debate happening, and why there are many pieces at the table that we need to be mindful of, so that when we have a UN tax convention, because we will get it, because the history and the righteousness is on their side of this agenda. But once we get it, it is also part of a larger institutional framework that is really responding for the people and not for the capital that is now taking over in the hallways of the United Nations. And we see the corporate capture more and more filtering it with an unbelievable cynicism, like in the COP, the presidency of the COP is now a fossil fuels company. Like, how much are we going to endure? So my plea is a political plea to really gather a mobilization effort to support this initiative and many others that are really trying to get us back into the track that we need to save humanity and life. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emilia. Really, really good to remind us that this is still very much a colonial extractive strategy, right? It is being disguised with technical jargon. I think that that's something really important, a very important takeaway. And also how the rich countries and the G20 are just like playing, and then they're just not satisfied with the principle of universality and the one country, one vote. They just want at least 2 votes for them, or even bigger. And that's why we really need to remain vigilant. Definitely the UN is the right space to be having the UN tax convention, but we cannot be complacent, because we know that all this pressure, all these interests are going to be there. And also, again, particularly important, how it's being captured, particularly by corporate interests, how we keep seeing them at the right table, having these massive platforms all the time. And also how we have been seeing also from Antonio Guterres, how he keeps mentioning this issue of de-risking and having to leverage private money, private funds, because we don't have enough. Well, why do they have the money? Because they are stealing it, really. As blunt as that, right? So they shouldn't. That's why we really need to have progressive taxation. That's why we really need to be taxing wealth. That's why we really need to have proper, like, corporate income tax. That's why we really need to be stopping all these tax incentives. As Tony was reminding us, like, these are harmful tax incentives. They don't really encourage development. They're only encouraging, like, really, like, loose food companies, and then just, again, extracting the funds. And they're always going to rich countries, and not even to rich countries to be enjoyed by the citizens, no. Only for to the investors, right? To rich people to become richer, and inequality to become, like, even wider, at the same time that we are seeing the destruction of the planet. So this is really a time to be rethinking about how we can have a UN tax system that could really deliver for, like, the well-being of the people and the planet, who will be able to deliver the SDGs and to really deliver on the human rights. So with this, and sorry, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So I'm Maria Ron Balsera, and I am the Director of Programs for the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And now it is your turn to be able to ask questions. I'm going to take a few at a time, and then ask the panelists. Sorry? Oh, yeah, of course. Comments, questions, reflections, but let's try to keep them to maximum 1 or 2 minutes, okay? We don't want another presentation. So that'll be great. So please put your hand up if you would like to, yeah, I can see one hand up. Start thinking of others. So please go, yeah, if you know how to operate the microphone.
Yep. Hi, thank you so much for the panelists because it was such an interesting event. And since we're in a framework of sustainability, my question is regarding that topic. Like, what's the role of sustainability and green taxes in this new reform tax resolution?
Thank you. Any other question before I pass it over to the speakers? Oh, yes, please. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Bei Ying. I'm Chinese. I grew up in Mexico, and I'm currently a 6th-semester law student.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I see another question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the panelists. My name is Bonnie Berry. I work for Save the Children here in New York, and I have more of a comment and to situate this, I think, within a wider context of why all this matters, why talking about finance, tax, debt, all these issues are really important. And it is a matter of human rights. And it is a matter of survival for many. For many, this means life and death. If countries in the global south do not have the fiscal space, the resources to invest in public services, children go hungry, children die, children are not educated, they're not protected. And what does that mean for the future? It's also a matter of peace and security. If this continues, countries will not have a social cohesion. We're going to see more conflict, more aggression, and less peace. So it is of the utmost importance that these issues are tackled, and they're tackled in the most democratic way here at the UN. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay. Over there, please. Palak. Okay. Oh, do you want to go first?
Hi, I am Palak. Can you hear me? I am a fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and my question actually follows up on comments from Maria and what Bonnie just said. It's an open question to the panel. If you think that our calls for reform or the discourse generally calls and requires an increased use of human rights terminology, or do you find that it's easier to counter market-based solutions with more definitive financial terminology, such as redirection to sustainable development goals, because they have more set target indicators that are easier to measure?
Thank you very much. I will take one more question.
Good morning. Yuk Ling from the World Network. Emilia, you talked about the attack on multilateralism from within the UN system. I mean, we've seen that going on for a long time, and I think that is part of the bigger struggle, right, to protect the public space, both at the national level and also internationally. And we know why that's been happening. So I just wanted to know, in terms of the advocacy for the tax convention, a full-fledged tax body, and all the pieces we need to move, at the same time, to what extent should civil society engage or not engage? I think that's a very big discussion with some of these processes. The Summit of the Future is actually out for grabs. I think it is being shaped. Some of us have gotten together to sort of work on the digital compact. I mean, the word compact made a lot of us in civil society run for our lives, because we remember the other compact. But again, it is also, to be shaped. So I think it's a very important question. Do we engage? Do we not engage? And if other pieces outside undermine what we need to do in the UN, then we also need to engage in those other pieces. So I just wanted to throw that to the panel in terms of how we need to organize ourselves. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm going to now I think that we can then take a second round. So shall we start? Because I think 4 questions is enough, and then we will take a second round, and you were Bernard. So who would like to start? From here? Emilia, there was a question there.
Yeah, that was painful, Jocelyn. Should I try again? So this is the big question, right? Because the process is unfolding super fast and is really happening. Yes. And so at least there's also a lot of opacity in the information flow. So civil society so far has tried to monitor sessions to understand what is happening, because there are no real flow of information that says this is the pathway, this is what is going to happen. We know that the G77 countries have said that they don't have the capacity to discuss all of these issues and also engage, for instance, in a meaningful process such as the tax convention, because they are so dispersed in all of the Summit of the Future process. But from our end, we do understand that our advocacy is more in supporting the G77 delegates rather than us going and chase all of the sessions, because it's ridiculous, really. We think that it's an illegitimate process. So what we are trying to do is to support the developing countries who are really trying to have a critical voice on this and who need also some technical support. But for the time being, that's been the strategy. But to be honest, the lack of information is also blocking us from having a more sophisticated strategy. So in the upcoming months from here to the General Assembly, we hope that we will have a clearer path and we have more clarity as to how to engage. But you're right, for instance, the Digital Compact process had been going on for quite some months now, and it has been a decision of some civil society critical organizations to at least monitor and find out how the process is going to be. But yeah, so the issue is that from the point of view of the co-chairs and the member state, do they think that we are legitimizing? That's, I think, a bigger question.
Okay. Two connected things, really. Not directly replying, but commenting on the comments. The first thing is when we say UN Tax Convention, it means it will be a set of principles guiding what tax should do. It's not about the rate of tax. It is about the principles that should guide taxation policy. So it should have a principle about how human rights should be not affected negatively by taxing policies, about environment and the rest. So it is comprehensive because it has to set principles for the policies, not defining the policies themselves. So in that sense, that is why convention is a good approach. The second issue is this. Why are we for a UN process? Because it is transparent, because it is in front of the public. The OECD process, I was once invited to the negotiation of inclusive framework somewhere in they gave me 5 minutes. I spoke and then, thank you, sir. So it is opaque. You don't know even what your governments are representing there. So if it is a UN process, we as citizens have two things. One, we can influence the outcome through our public advocacy, and B, we can hold our respective negotiators to account for positions they hold and for positions they don't hold. Even if you go to the inclusive framework of the OECD, it is not conducted by a neutral body. A UN secretariat is a neutral body, whereas OECD secretariat is the secretariat of the Club of the Rich. Can you imagine the secretariat of Employers Association conducting negotiations, facilitating negotiations between trade unions and employees? That is the situation we are in. So the two things we are saying is, one, guided by principle, not by sectorial policy or lobbied outcomes, but based on principles. And second, a transparent way in which we also influence both outcome and process through our vigilant participation in the process.
So with regard to human rights, of course, I think everything should be framed in terms of human rights because that's the most important thing. And I think the question of sustainability was kind of answered by Bonnie herself, no? So we need a lot of money in order to, healthcare, education, etc., etc. Now, with respect to using metrics in terms of are we supposed to choose between using metrics, arithmetic, etc., on one hand, or human rights on the other hand? I don't think there's a divergence. Actually, there's a conflict. I think we should actually use metrics and measuring. Of course, Emilia mentioned that we shouldn't be too technical, but sometimes I think we can also delve into technicalities because at the end of the day, maybe they can be broken down in simple terms. So, for example, part of our discourse is that the effective tax rates of poor people are actually higher than the effective tax rates of the billionaires because, poor people, okay, they're not paying income tax. But 100% of what they are earning, they spend on things that are, that where they pay VAT, where they pay income, excise tax, and obviously corporate tax also because these are produced by big companies as well. While the rich people, they can only spend so much that could be used. And at the same time, the rich people, if you will take a look, they become rich not because of compensation income as employees. They became rich because of inheritance. They became rich because the value of the shares of stock of the companies that they formed or the companies where the shares of stock that they bought actually increased. And these things are actually non-taxable events. I think I heard Maria speaking about wealth tax. That's why, for example, in the Philippines, we're advocating, actually the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, we have a study, we're advocating for wealth tax, precisely because these non-taxable events should be captured by a wealth tax.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll try and also sort of connect some of the dots around also where do we engage on, if we engage and things like that. Some of these are very old tactics, yeah, where you sort of flood processes with so many different things and in the full knowledge that certain stakeholders, the most important stakeholders, may not have the ability to be in all these different places and will be preoccupied and therefore certain types of decisions that are being taken in these outside these formal democratic spaces then tend to be the ones that dominate the airwaves. And I think we have to be careful with that because that's exactly what, for example, was attempted in Paris a few weeks ago. Some of these other summits that are being proposed are exactly that same tactic to try and thin out the progressive and alternative voices in this space in order to ensure that there is no adequate representation there. So we need to be very careful, and as civil society groups, as developing country groups, we need to be very strategic and see and have some sort of unison and coherence and common purpose in making sure that these alternative places that are being created are not dividing and then conquering what the bigger agenda is for us as a community. I also want to add that we need to be careful that we don't go down the rabbit hole where we forget that if we do not address the principles of how global finance and global economic activity is governed, then what ends up happening is this circular cycle of crisis where you continue to work your way on just short-term interventions to deal with the present crisis and forget about the medium and long-term transformative. And I think this is why the advancement and supporting of and calling for the tax convention becomes very important, because it's not about dealing with the crisis today. It's about dealing with what is going to happen in the future and that transformative ability to get developing countries out of the situation they're in today into a different position as to where they are tomorrow. The 500 billion that is being asked for is to deal with the crisis today, but for countries in the global south to remain in that same perpetual state of poverty and dependency on a system that continues to extract. So I think we also must be very careful not to get caught up with these different types of figures and summits, which are largely about maintaining the status quo, and then the bigger picture, which is about transforming how developing countries take their positions in the global architecture. Thank you.
Now I'm going to take another round of questions. We are going to start with Werner, and let me know the others.
Hello, good morning. My name is Werner Munoz. I work for the Global Campaign for Education. Thank you so much for such a rich presentations. The Global Campaign for Education is ready to campaign for the UN Convention, so we are count on us. So as you rightly said, corporates are taking over the public governance in many different fields, including education and at all levels, including the UN and UNESCO, for instance. And this is happening with the consent of governments that should be taxing the rich. But at the same time, there are the arising of corporate foundations which are trying to replace civil society. And we have also seen how some international NGOs are benefiting from the private funding and the consent of governments in this regard. So this can not only weakening civil society movement, but also kind of reshaping civil society, stand and forces. So what is your view on what should be done in order to counteract this process? Thank you.
Thank you, Werner. More questions, comments, or reflections? No? Good. Okay, in that case, I'm going to ask do we have another question there? No. I'm going to ask the speakers to try to answer that question, but also to give us a bit of a takeaway. And in that takeaway, I would ask you to be actionable and to be thinking of what would you like us to do between now and October, and also in the long term, as Jason was saying, not to be only thinking of this short term and this $500 billion, but in terms of first what we need to do to support the UN Tax Convention, and then what do we need to do to have a radical reform, which is progressive, which would of the global financial architecture that would work for the people and the planet. And we will start again with Emilia, then Dereje, Tony, and Jason. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to tell Tony that I'm super grateful for all of the unpacking that the three of you have been doing on the technical issues. I didn't want to undermine that. I was actually going to say that thanks to this type of work is that we understand that the technical jargon has been used and weaponized against us. And so it is very good that organizations have gone into that, despite the jargon, to unveil the real intentions behind those. So just wanted to say that clearly. As of the corporate capture, yes, we've heard that UNESCO is joining Formula One and Nestlé, and some of us who work on the BlackRock campaign last year were trying to map all of the specific corporate capture of each of the UN agencies that are happening, and it's super long. So it's really super dire. So, and even more this language on network multi-stakeholderism that is really trying to take over a real multilateral decision-making process here in the UN. It's a real threat there. So I think that we need to do specific actions, but also keeping in mind the bigger picture, for instance, supporting the UN Global Tax Convention, but keeping also in the bigger picture that this network multi-stakeholderism is targeting each and every one of the UN processes. So we need to be alert, we need to be in networks, and it's hopefully those of us who were leading on the BlackRock campaign will try to do a second call this year against corporate capture more broadly.
Okay, I have two appeals. The first one is, as I said earlier, the OECD, although its reform is about 10% of global profit, and Tony said 103, my count is 86 multinational companies. They are trying to do a multilateral convention and force countries to sign it. The thing is to confront the UN process with a fait accompli and then tell us, agreement has been reached, you don't need. So what we should do is we should prevent this from being signed. We have started a campaign. Don't sign a blank check by ceding your taxing rights. This is very important. And, you know, it's just like running a mafia business. To preempt everything, previously it was said consensual decision by an inclusive framework, but now they say a critical mass of countries. It does not matter that the US will not be signing. As long as developing countries are prevented from introducing unilateral action, they don't care. You know, they boast about the minimum standard that is agreed upon by OECD. And who is not signing? The US. So the whole process is to make laws that are binding to others and leaves the hands free of the most notorious multinational company owner in the world. So preventing this signature, we say also critical mass of countries should not sign it because they are ceding their taxing rights. Stopping this is a prerogative. The second one is there will be in the UN process as well an attempt to divide developing countries. Divide and rule has always been an successful imperial tactic. So we have to keep the unity of the G77 around the UN, in the struggle for UN taxation. So unity of global South countries within the UN process, stopping the OECD adventure of making countries sign a law, a convention which will force them to cede their taxing rights. So these are my two asks which we have to defend. Thank you.
Thank you, Dereje. Tony?
So yeah, with regard to corporate capture, I think that's an excellent point. I think what we should do is that we should expose them in terms of who are funding them and what are the interests of groups and organizations and individuals who are funding them. And then it's basically one plus one. No? So who's funding them and what their positions are. So obviously, if they're being funded by the big corporations, obviously they're against the UN process and in favor of the OECD. In terms of what we should do, I think what we continue to emphasize at GATJ is the importance of the domestic struggle. Of course, this space is extremely important, but we have to go back to our countries and engage the three different branches of our governments, in fact. No? So the congressional and the executive. Well, in terms of congressional, we should ask our legislators to even conduct congressional hearings, parliamentary hours, etc., in order to question all of these things that are happening and to support our government in terms of supporting the UN process. In the Philippines, for example, we even went to the extent of going to the Supreme Court in order to block free trade agreements. Oh, by the way, the G20 OECD IF on BEPS, it's actually propping up even in free trade agreements. So, for example, in IPEF, no, it's part of Pillar 4, if I'm not mistaken. So you have the congressional, parliamentary, and then the executive branch. We are in constant dialogue with our Ministry of Finance, with our Ministry of Trade and Industry, and even with our Foreign Ministry with respect to what's happening at the UN system and how it is important to block the OECD BEPS framework. I think that should be all for now. Thank you.
I think not much to add after what Emilia, Dereje, and Tony have said, but I think importantly is two things. One is the legitimacy of this process is derived from the constituencies that we represent at the national level, and that is citizens. The corporate capture of institutions within or agencies within the United Nations comes at a cost. And I always ask, in platforms where I have to speak, I always try and paint this picture where ask yourself, why is it that it is possible in certain parts of the world for children and citizens to have very easy access to public services at almost no cost in the global north, but in the global south, it is very easy for our government to accept a privatization and market-based approach in providing these exact same services and expect us to have universal coverage in accessing these public services. That does not add up. And the reason that does not add up is because we are constantly forced to give up our sovereignty in raising our own revenues to fund our own public services and break those shackles of dependency and those vicious cycles of indebtedness that perpetuates the poverty and inequality that exists in our regions and in our parts of the world. So the call for the tax convention is legitimized by the very bad situation that our citizens face back home, those who are our constituents as civil society organizations, but is worse off also at the global level where our member states are arm-twisted into making these types of concessions that result in that. So it's incredibly important that we stay and stand very strong, as Dereje, Tony, and Emilia have said, in ensuring that the support for the Africa Group and the broader developing country groups here in New York is not broken by any other attempt to move away from having this tax convention adopted and retained within the UN system. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. And just to conclude, just to say that, as Emilia was saying, this is not something which is abstract. It is very much real. People are dying every day. People are excluded from their human rights because there is not enough revenue to actually fund them. This is very real, and it has consequences. When you don't have revenue coming from taxes, from progressive taxation, then you have to borrow, then you have debt, you have debt crisis, and then we see that the creditors are put above the people and the planet. When we don't have money to pay for these services, then the whole neoliberal and privatization schemes come in, the whole financialization in order to make more profit from the suffering comes in, right? This is our chance. This is a unique opportunity to really push for this UN tax convention. And everything is happening, really. Like this year and in the last few years, we have the Cartagena summit, the Ministers of Finance summit, which is going to be happening at the end of this month. We have a lot of opportunities, really, to be involved. And the tax justice is not only tax for experts, it's the justice part that really brings us all together. So with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention and for being here and for the wonderful speakers. So please help me in a round of applause. And I've always wanted to use one of these, so this is finished.
Thank you.